On March 25, 2026, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a landmark resolution declaring the transatlantic trafficking and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. The decision, passed with 123 votes in favour, 3 against, Argentina, Israel, and the United States, and 52 abstentions, marks a historic shift in the international recognition of one of the most devastating systems in human history. The resolution places reparations at the centre of global justice discourse, affirming that addressing historical wrongs against Africans and people of African descent is both necessary and overdue. But to understand the weight of this moment, you have to go back. Far beyond resolutions, far beyond diplomacy, to a time when human beings became commodities, and the world called it trade. The story of the transatlantic slave trade does not begin with ships crossing the ocean. It begins with a shift in power and a shift in imagination. In the 15th century, European kingdoms were expanding. Portugal, under Prince Henry the Navigator, began exploring the West African coast, not initially for people, but for gold, spices, and routes to Asia. But very quickly, something changed. Human beings became part of the equation. By the mid-1400s, the Portuguese had begun capturing and transporting Africans to Europe. What started as small-scale enslavement soon evolved into something far larger, something structured, something systematic. And then came the moment that would change everything. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas. Within decades, European powers realized that the lands they had encountered were not just territories, they were opportunities. Vast lands, endless resources. But there was a problem: labor. Indigenous populations were decimated by disease, violence, and exploitation. And so, European powers turned increasingly toward Africa. Not because Africa lacked people, but because Africa was now being targeted. By the 16th century, the transatlantic slave trade had taken form as a triangular system. Ships left Europe carrying manufactured goods, guns, textiles, alcohol. These goods were exchanged on the African coast for enslaved people. Those people were then transported across the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage. And in the Americas, they were sold in exchange for raw materials: sugar, tobacco, cotton, which were then shipped back to Europe. A cycle, a system, a machine. And at the centre of that machine were human lives. Along the West African coast, forts and castles were built. Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana, established by the Portuguese in 1482, became one of the earliest and most infamous. Later, the British took control of it. Cape Coast Castle followed. These structures were not just buildings, they were processing points in a global system of human extraction. Inside them, thousands were held in dungeons, dark, airless, overcrowded. Men separated from women, adults separated from children. Days blurred into nights. The only certainty was uncertainty, waiting to be sold, waiting to be shipped, waiting for a future they could not imagine. Above these dungeons, life continued. European officials dined, traded, negotiated. Below, humanity was suspended. The capture of enslaved Africans was not always carried out directly by Europeans. The demand they created reshaped existing political dynamics within Africa. Some African leaders and intermediaries became involved in supplying captives through warfare, raids, and trade. This is a difficult truth, but it is an important one, because it reminds us that the system was not simple. It was engineered, pressured, sustained by global forces of demand and profit. However, the scale, the industrialization, the global profit that was driven overwhelmingly by European powers. They built the ships, they financed the voyages, they created the markets, they defined the system. Then came the journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, a term that sounds almost neutral, but there was nothing neutral about it. One of the most horrifying chapters in human history. People were packed into ships like cargo, chained together, lying in rows so tight that turning was nearly impossible. The air was thick with sweat, blood, vomit, and disease. Dysentery, smallpox, measles spread rapidly. The ships became floating prisons. Some voyages lasted 6 weeks, others stretched longer. Mortality rates could reach 15 to 20%, sometimes higher. But even that number fails to capture the full reality, because behind every number was a person, a mother, a father, a child. Some resisted. There were rebellions on ships organised, desperate attempts to reclaim freedom. Many were brutally suppressed. Others chose another form of resistance. They refused to eat. They jumped overboard. They chose death over bondage. When the ships arrived in the Americas, those who survived entered another phase of dehumanization. They were inspected, teeth, muscles, skin, like livestock, sold at auctions, given new names, stripped of language, culture, identity. Families were separated without hesitation, and then put to work. On sugar plantations in the Caribbean, on cotton fields in the American South, on tobacco farms in Virginia. The work was relentless, sunrise to sunset, under the watch of overseers, punished for slowing down, punished for resisting, punished for existing. This was not just forced labour, this was chattel slavery, a system where a human being was legally defined as property, where their children inherited that status, where their lives were owned completely. And yet, within this system of oppression, there was resistance, always resistance. Enslaved Africans preserved fragments of their cultures through music, through language, through belief systems. They formed communities. They resisted in small ways and in large uprisings. In Haiti, that resistance led to revolution. In 1791, enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, they fought and won. By 1804, Haiti had become the first black republic in the world and the first nation born of a successful slave revolt. It sent shockwaves across the globe because it proved something powerful, that even the most brutal system could be challenged. At the same time, voices began to rise against the slave trade itself. In Britain, abolitionists like William Wilberforce pushed relentlessly in Parliament. Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved African, published his autobiography, exposing the horrors of the trade to the world. Thomas Clarkson gathered evidence chains, ship diagrams, testimonies to show the brutality. The image of the slave ship, Brooks, its human cargo laid out in rows, became a symbol of the movement. In the Americas, figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman would later continue the fight against slavery itself. These voices mattered because they forced society to confront what it had normalized. By the early 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade began to be abolished. Britain banned it in 1807. The United States followed the same year. Other nations followed gradually. But abolition did not mean justice, because slavery itself continued. And even after slavery was formally ended, its legacy did not disappear. The world that emerged from the transatlantic slave trade was not neutral. It was shaped by it. Wealth accumulated in Europe and the Americas was built on centuries of unpaid labour. African societies had been destabilised. Generations had been lost. And the descendants of those enslaved inherited not just history, but its consequences. Inequality, racial hierarchies, systemic discrimination. The echoes of the past became structures of the present. And for a long time, the world did not fully acknowledge this. The transatlantic slave trade was taught, but often incompletely. Its brutality was softened, its scale understated, its impact disconnected from modern realities. It became history without accountability. Which is why this moment, this 2026 declaration, matters so deeply.
On this beautiful day in March, we're called to stand on the right side of history. Let it be recorded that when history beckoned, we did what was right for the memory of the millions who suffered the indignity of the slave trade and those who continue to suffer racial discrimination. Let our vote on this resolution restore their dignity and humanity.
Because to call it the gravest crime against humanity is not just symbolic. It is a recognition of scale, of intent, of impact. It is an acknowledgement that this was not just a tragedy, but a crime. A crime that shaped the modern world. And yet, even now, the response is not unanimous. 3 countries voted against, 52 abstained. And that tells us something important. Because recognising a crime of this magnitude does more than describe the past. It challenges the present. It raises questions about reparations, about justice, about responsibility. Questions that remain uncomfortable. But history has always been uncomfortable, and the truth even more so. Because if it can take over 400 years for the world to fully recognise the gravity of the transatlantic slave trade, then we must ask ourselves, what else are we still refusing to name? What injustices today are we normalising? What system are we benefiting from without questioning? History is not just a record of what happened. It is a mirror. And sometimes it takes centuries for humanity to look into that mirror and finally tell the truth.
And we must never forget the malevolent system that sustained it for so long. I welcome the steps some countries are taking to apologize for their role in the evil of slavery and to join an honest dialogue about its lasting consequences.